made a video about the whole of the concept of property using a passage from the encyclopedia. And now we have to go back again to the philosophy of right proper. And I wanted to skip a little bit, and then we come to this paragraph 65, the beginning of the alienation of property and the transition to contract. So let's take a look at the passages that we have now before us. Paragraph 65 is the start of this section, alienation of property. The reason I can alienate my property is that it is mine only insofar as I put my will into it. Hence I may abandon, de relinquere in Latin, as ownerless anything that I have, or yield it to the will of another, and so into his possession, provided always that the thing in question is a thing external by nature. This right of alienation is illustrative of what it really means to have property, and it's a very important element in preparation of the concept of contract. Alienation of property, to take something into your possession, appropriation of a thing, or the usage of a thing that we found, that you can find in paragraph 59 to 64, all of these express the principle of property. This is really the way that it works when I put my will into something in order to use it, or just to own it, or in this case to disappropriate it, to alienate it. Now, that seems to be very paradoxical, because usage seems to refer to possession and not to ownership. The alienation of property seems to be the opposite of appropriation and property. Nevertheless, within the concept of property, the ultimate substance or essence is the fact that I can express my freedom and my free will as something that is referring to itself, that is self-relatedness, and not just totally absorbed by the thing that I own. So that is a very important element. Now, this objectivation or realization of my free will, therefore, will express itself not only in appropriation, but also in alienation. Both my putting my will into something and withdrawing my will from something shows me that my free will is above and beyond the things that I own, is a positive and a negative force at the same time. It presumes and expresses that my personality, in a legal sense, my personality is beyond the very concrete and factual relationship that I have with my property. So I can withdraw from a thing, and I can yield it to the will of another. Now, that also means that the thing that I own and that I now yield to someone else implies that this thing has no rights in itself. It's the person that is the carrier of right and not the thing that I own. That implies the critical function of the concept of property in Hegel's philosophy, because it follows that we cannot own persons. A person cannot be owned. So it's the end of the idea of slavery. Because things do not have a will of their own, we can do with them whatever we please. Now, this right to alienate my property is, of course, limited to those things that can be truly a property of mine. The thing has to be external by its nature and not forced upon it some kind of externality. You can have this system of slavery whereby you act as if a person is just an object. But such a person will never be a thing or an object by its own nature. It will be against its own nature. So this right of alienation, as is the right of appropriation, is limited to those things that by nature are external. Property is only related to something that is external to the person. What is not completely external, what is part of being a person, is not a subject of property law and therefore cannot be alienated or yielded to the will of someone else. We cannot give ourselves in that sense to someone else to become his or her property. Persons cannot be degraded to things that are the object of the will of someone else. Now, the reason, therefore, is, of course, immediately clear. If the whole meaning of right, of law, is to bring freedom to existence, to give it an external expression within reality, then there can not be such a thing as a right to negate that freedom. I cannot negate my own freedom. I cannot negate the freedom of others. If I would be able to negate the concept of freedom, there would be a contradiction, because I would have to use my freedom in order to negate my freedom. And that would be, of course, self-contradictory. We would appeal to the fact of personality in order to negate the concept of personality. Of course, that is absolutely self-contradictory and therefore impossible. Slavery, therefore, is unlawful and contrary to justice. The person ceases to exist within slavery. A slave is someone who does not belong to himself, but to someone else. His own will is not within himself, but his will belongs to someone else. Someone else wills whatever he must do. Now, you cannot have a slavery that is voluntary. There's no such thing. That would be the opposite of my being, my action of becoming a slave, giving myself into slavery would be exactly in contradiction with my own being as a free will. The free will would therefore exist as not being a free will. Now, it's absolutely unlawful, according to Hegel, to discard my own rationality and my own conscience and my own religious beliefs. Those things, conscious beliefs, rationality, are not external things by nature. They constitute the essence of my personality. So when others think in my place or decide what I have to believe or what I need to do, I have given up my own personality. Now, this is something else when we're going to talk about my labor and my capacity to produce something. According to Hegel, my physical and intellectual capacities are part and parcel of my own being as a person, but nevertheless they are particular elements of my personality. They do not coincide with my personality as a whole. And that is the reason that Hegel is arguing that in a limited fashion I can give away my labor and my capacity for production, because my labor and production will not be the same as my personality as a whole. They will not define the universality of my person. So I can give part of my time to labor for someone else. I can give part of my power, my capacity to produce something. I can give that away, or I can go into a contract relationship and give some of it in order to get something else in return. Now, this would not be true if the whole of my labor and the time I can spend on labor and the whole of my productivity would be alienated from me. Then it would be identical to slavery, because, as he says in paragraph 67, let's take a look at that now. In paragraph 67, I have to find it first. Single products of my particular physical and mental skill and of my power to act, I can alienate to someone else, and I can give him the use of my abilities for a restricted period. Because on the strength of this restriction, my abilities acquire an external relation to the totality and universality of my being. So when I labor for someone else, when I go to work, then what I'm doing there and the labor that I'm performing becomes external, not by nature, but through the act of performing this labor, it gets an external relation to the totality of my being. It is particularized. By alienating the whole of my time as crystallized in my work and everything I produced, I would be making into another's property the substance of my being, my universal activity and actuality, my personality. So whenever I alienate the whole of my time, it's simple slavery. But also, when I produce something that now becomes someone else's property, then I would be making that property that now belongs to someone else the substance of my being when I give it all up. So there has to be some kind of compensation for that, and that is, of course, my wages. So I get something in return. So it's me being the owner of the product, then in a way selling it into the ownership of the ultimate producer, my boss at work. And that is why this giving up, this alienation of the substance of my work does not imply slavery. So it's the wages that prevent the fact that I alienate my product to become equivalent to slavery. Okay. Now it's very important that Hegel also states that my life itself cannot become external to my personality. And he says that in paragraph 70. Let's take a look at that now. Paragraph 70, after discussing the difficult issue of copyright, the comprehensive totality of external activity, i.e. life, is not external to personality, which is itself immediate and a this. My life is not something that I can dispose of. It's not something within my grasp. It's something that I am. The disposal or sacrifice of life is not the existence of this personality, but the very opposite. I have therefore no right whatsoever to dispose of my life. Only an ethical idea in which this immediately individual personality is in itself immersed and to whose power it is actually subjected has such a right to dispose of my life. So it's only an ethical idea that can bring me to the point that I go beyond the need for self-preservation, that I go beyond the need to respect my own life and make my life, in a sense, external to me, something that I can give up. Just as life as such is immediate, so death is its immediate negativity, and hence must come from without, either by natural causes or else in the service of the idea by the hand of a foreigner, which implies that Hegel is thinking about battle and struggle and war. So this is the position of a soldier that gives up his life in the service of the idea and is killed by a foreigner. So there is no negation of my personality involved when the ethical idea, the Sittlichkeit, so let's say my social being, is involved here. But as such, I have no right whatsoever to dispose of my life. That implies that suicide, for instance, is out of the question, in the sense that suicide involves a self-contradiction of my free will. I'm giving up by free will my free will itself. So that is a contradiction. Life is a condition for freedom, at least in this very abstract and immediate shape that we're discussing now within the confines of abstract right. But if life is a condition of freedom, then of course it will be completely contradictory when I take my own life in freedom. That's an argument against suicide. That does not rob me of my freedom, but it's merely the implication of freedom considered as pure autonomy and as rationality, because it is rational for a human being to avoid this practical self-contradiction, acting in such a way that the conditions of my acting in such a way are negated. That would be irrational and therefore something to be avoided. It doesn't mean that for Hegel, life as such is the highest concept. On the contrary, in the whole sphere of the ethical idea, we will find that life, as it is defined within the abstract nature of right and the abstract freedom that it involves, has only a limited validity. Within the sphere of property, freedom is only coming into existence in a very limited and elementary form. Now, in the next form of abstract right, the contract, we will find more of the internal components of freedom expressed. So that is something that we need to look at the next time. Let's now go back to paragraph 65 after this brief introduction, and let's read some of the text at least. So let's go to paragraph 65 again. So we discussed this. I can alienate my property because it is mine only insofar as I put my will into it. So as long as I put my will into it, the thing carries the sign of my appropriation, yet my free will is not absorbed within the object of my property, so I can abandon it and in that sense exercise and objectify my free will in the same manner. No, let's go to 66. Therefore, those goods, or rather substantial characteristics, which constitute my very own person and the universal essence of my self-consciousness are inalienable, and my right to them is imprescriptible. So nobody can tell me how to deal with my self-consciousness and my personality. I remain completely free in that sense. They never become a thing that someone else can dispose of. Such characteristics are my personality as such, my universal freedom of will, my ethical life, my religion. They are substantial characteristics and not external realities. So let's move on to the next paragraph, 67. Single products of my particular physical and mental skill and of my power to act, I can alienate to someone else. So this is the possibility of work, labor for someone else. I can give him the use of my abilities for a restricted period. If it's if it's all of my time, all of my abilities, then we have a case of slavery, because then there is no distinction between my free will and this particular exercise of my free will in the form of physical and mental activities. So it has to be a restricted period. Because on the strength of this restriction, my abilities acquire an external relation to the totality and universality of my being. That's the reason that it is at all possible that I become an employee and work for someone else. Of course, then there has to be a compensation for the fact that I give up the result of my endeavors. By alienating the whole of my time as crystallized in my work and everything I produced, I would be making into another's property the substance of my being. So I would give myself to become the object of someone else's will, and therefore become someone else's property. Can't be done. You can't do that, which is, of course, in a way reminding us of basic Marxian notions about ownership of the product, and then the problem of wages, that wages do not represent the true value of the product for someone else. But that's something we will discuss later. What is peculiarly mine in the product of my spirit may, owing to the method whereby it is expressed, turn at once into something external, like a thing, which eo ipso may then be produced by other people. So a product of my spirit may become external because it can be reproduced. The result is that by taking possession of a thing of this kind, its new owner may make his own the thoughts communicated in it or the technical invention which it contains. And it is the ability to do this which sometimes, i.e. in the case of books, constitutes the value of these things and the only purpose of possessing them. So the reproducibility of the products of my spirit may exactly be the value of the thing. So it's not one single thing, but it's the thought that is communicated in a book, which simply by being reproduced into many books, large edition of those books, exactly becomes the purpose of the thing. That's the value of the thing, that it can be reproduced. But besides this, the new owner at the same time comes into possession of the universal methods of so expressing himself and producing numerous other things of the same sort. So the product of the spirit, the thoughts that are therein, may give rise to new products. It, in a way, reproduces itself also in other books and other forms of literature or art. And that's exactly what is supposed to be happening. So this is a peculiar way of possession and property. I am the owner of my own thoughts, but as soon as I make them into something external, like print my thoughts in a book, then this book, as a natural thing, as a physical thing, can be reproduced. And at the same time, the ideas that I expressed can be used by someone else in order to form a new set of ideas. Since the owner of such a product, in owning a copy of it, so now the thing becomes a copy of the original, and the original somehow is what I meant it to be, is in possession of the entire use and value of that copy qua an individual thing. I'm the owner of this copy of the book. Even if the author of the book or the inventor of the technical device remains the owner of the universal ways and means of reproducing such products and things. So I own the book, I bought the book, but I have not bought the right to reproduce that book, to print it again. Qua universal ways and means of expression, he has not immediately alienated them, but may reserve them to himself as means of expression which belong to him. So I remain the owner of my words, my thoughts expressed in this book, and yet someone else is also to be considered the owner of that individual copy of the book. And now the question remains, is he also the owner of the thoughts expressed therein? And the answer is no, not really. So let's go on to the next paragraph. This is, you have to study that for yourself. It's the whole discussion of copyright, which belonged to the 19th century. Maybe we can also take something interesting out of that. But of course, Hegel's discussion of copyright issues is nowhere near the complexity of that idea in our present time with the internet and digital reproduction, etc. Paragraph 70, the comprehensive totality of external activity, i.e. life, is not external to personality, which is itself immediate and this. Personality, even in its abstract sense, the immediate this here, the life of that, my life, is not external to myself. The disposal or sacrifice of life is not the existence of this personality, but the very opposite. So it's not expressing my freedom, it's not objectifying my existence, but of course it's exactly the opposite. It's destroying and negating my existence. Therefore, purely rational and on the basis of the principle of the autonomy of freedom, I have therefore no right whatsoever to dispose of my life. It would be self-contradictory. We discussed that, so I'll leave it at that. Now we go to paragraph 71, the transition from property to contract. And that I will discuss in my next video. Thanks for listening and see you next time.